All right, y'all, welcome back to Mountain Tales and River Stories, episode 5. Old Timers. Steady snow was falling as the last of the weak winter sun faded across the far ridge. The dry white powder clung to the tan fur of a field-dressed doe hanging high from a stout branch of a mature white oak. The rope looped through the carcass's hind leg tendons was tied off to a nearby maple. Coyotes eyed the gut pile and waited for complete darkness to clean the ground. A long shadow length from where the deer hung stood a haggard old cabin whose outer logs were well worn from over 100 years' exposure to the elements. Half a dozen sets of deer antlers were nailed to the side of the cabin, the bleached out skull caps contrasting with the dark logs. An old green and white gas lantern with an orange rime of rust around the base hung from a chain looped over a nail that was pounded into a porch beam. A thin line of gray smoke rose from a sandstone chimney. Another line of smoke leaked from a stovepipe that emerged from the rusty tin roof. Falling snow obscured the definition of the surrounding ridgelines and encased the countryside in a muffled silence that is an integral part of the deep woods in winter. The only noticeable sounds were the occasional distant voices of two men talking within the cabin. Now, in their late 70s, they had been friends for over 60 years. Only the Lord knows how many campfires or steaming kettles of cowboy coffee or cases of beer or shots of whiskey they had shared. Their heavy boots cast aside for the evening, they sat in creaking rockers before the sandstone hearth with their feet in dollar store suede slippers. Both men wore flannel shirts and blue jeans over thermal underwear. The taller of the two also had an old rag wool sweater full of jagged holes. He called it his U-boat sweater since it resembled the sweaters worn by bearded German U-boat captains in pictures he had seen in Life magazine as a young kid during World War II. Over the sweater, he wore a red and black plaid insulated shirt jacket. The other man also wore a sweater and an American-made Woolrich canvas jacket with a colorful blanket lining. Between them stood a camp table on which were 2 shot glasses and 2 cans of beer, all illuminated by a single candle. Further illumination came from a number of candles arranged on the mantel above the fireplace, as well as 2 oil lamps on another table and a lamp on top of an old pie safe. Behind them, near the far wall, a wood-burning stove sat hot and humming, its stovepipe ticking. Surplus army cots were set up on opposite walls, each with a sleeping bag and wool blankets on top, and boots underneath. A Colt single-action revolver hung barrel up by its trigger guard from a strategically placed nail in the cabin wall 1 foot above one of the cots. Green and yellow cartridge boxes were stacked on the mantel near the candles. 2 Winchester lever-action rifles lay mounted horizontally on a wall rack. One was a pre-64 Model 94 with a ghost ring rear sight, the other an 1873 38-40 with an octagon barrel, buckhorn sight, and crescent butt plate. On the big table, which was the room's centerpiece, was 1/3 of a bottle of vodka, a large bottle of sour mash, a flashlight, an iron skillet, a small coffee pot, 2 tin cups, plates and forks, in addition to the oil lamps. All rested on a stained newspaper that served as a makeshift tablecloth. A large coffee pot stood on the wood stove to warm water for washing up. Steam slowly rising above its opened lid with the bail suspended in midair. A neatly stacked pile of stove wood stood against the far wall behind the stove. All around the wall hung coats, orange vests, and wooden hats from various pegs nailed into the wall at shoulder height. The old cabin had no subfloor, and the cold crept up through the cracks, many of which were covered with well-burnished strips of silver duct tape. The taller of the 2 men rose and retrieved the vodka bottle from the table. How about another dipper? Spike said as he refilled both of the shot glasses. And another beer, replied the other, who was known as Tack. Despite the fact that each had 2 hearing aids apiece, they usually spoke louder than necessary. Spike sat back in his rocker and fumbled in the cardboard box next to his seat and handed his old drinking buddy another beer. They popped the tops and each took a sip and then set the cans back down on the table. Tack resumed conversation. That was the best liver and onions I've had in a long time. It's hard to get really fresh liver. She was a good-sized deer. Any bigger, and we would have had to tie her off to the bumper and use the truck to get her up in that tree. Too bad that big buck didn't come by. I'm happy with a doe. Hell, you can't eat horns. I guess you're right. Spike had shot the deer mid-morning from the porch. Both men were too old to go traipsing around in the mountains just for a damn deer when they could stay out of the wind and near a warm stove. Sardines, spam sandwiches, and hot coffee with a little sour mash made the hunt more civilized. The game trails all passed right by the cabin, and they had luck in the past waiting nearby, and eventually one showed up. Spike had been walking back from the outhouse behind the cabin, not far from where his beat-up Ford F-150 with a dented topper was parked, when he saw Tack waving his arms and pointing. Tack had just returned to the door after answering a call of nature when he saw the doe walking slowly from the tree line, head down toward the salt block. Tack always brought his rifle, but his eyes meant he had trouble seeing, and he had never had a scope. With his rifle still in the cabin, he got Spike's attention, and Spike shot her at 50 yards with his left hand resting on a porch post for balance. He cleaned the deer with an ancient Blackfoot dag with a bear jaw handle that had been given to him years before by an old army buddy who lived near the Wind River in Wyoming. They rubbed snow in the cavity to clean it out good and then hung it up. As Spike thought about the day's hunt, he recalled it seemed everything he had and used anymore was old. The rifle was old, the knife was old, the cabin was old, his lanterns were old, his truck was old. Hell, he was old. He figured as long as they keep making new beer and whiskey, he'd be fine. He had all the other stuff he needed, and it was all old. After they had finished with the deer, careful to save the liver for supper, they made a late breakfast on the wood stove. Tack, who was the gourmet of the two, fried up country ham, bacon, and eggs. I've got some fresh cackleberries, he chimed as he pounded the hard brown eggs against the cast iron skillet. I hate a light yellow yolk. I only eat eggs with a dark orange yolk. They sat by the fire and sipped fresh coffee with their plates on their laps. I caught the last few minutes of Shane on TV the other night, Spike said between forkfuls of ham and covered in egg yolk over easy. I turned it on just as Shane calls Jack Palance a low-down Yankee liar. That's the best line in the whole movie. Jean Arthur had the best lines in the whole movie. Jean Arthur. I wonder if Shane nailed her. I hope so. I'd have been driving more than just fence posts if I'd have been working that ranch. Joey's daddy would have had to shoot me for sure. Say, why didn't you ever bring Jean Arthur down here? I called, but she was busy this weekend. Spike placed a few more logs on the fire and Tack checked his watch. I think the sun is over the yard arm, said Tack. I need some blood. He chucked the last of his coffee into the fireplace, wiped out the cup with his bandana, and poured in 2 fingers of vodka and some tomato juice from a bottle resting on the pie safe. He took a modest sip after giving the cup a little shake to properly bind the molecules to satisfy his discriminating palate. Not bad, makes me feel young again. 2 men had known each other so long that they knew all the stories. The conversation over the years at each camping trip was about 80% rehearsed from the last trip. They had spent 60 years hunting and camping anywhere they could, originally part of a larger entourage of good friends who one by one had passed on. They now suddenly found that they were the only two left. Many of their stories revolved around their departed buddies or of the great adventures they had shared. The vodka stirred Tack's memory. Remember that bullfight in Chihuahua City? How they butchered that son of a bitch and doled it out to the poor people? I never saw so many flies in one place in my life. Their first big road trip was a cross-country marathon that took them out to the plains of Nebraska, the mountains of Wyoming, the deserts of New Mexico, and on down through El Paso to Juarez and further south to Chihuahua. They had crossed the border in a shiny black 1958 Ford Fairlane, while Mexican accordion music blared from the radio. They even saw the car in which Pancho Villa was assassinated and met one of his many wives, a shriveled-up old crone who held out her hand for the price of admission. The trip was a tilt-a-whirl ride of tequila, swimming pools, mariachi music, hot peppers, bullfights, adobe, and whorehouses. They were young gringos who had the whole world before them. By the time they returned, they had spent enough time together that they felt like brothers. Theirs was a brotherhood of primarily outdoor adventure that manifested itself over the years to include endless campouts and hunting trips, including several moose hunting trips to Newfoundland and fishing in Alaska. They were as comfortable in a squad tent out in the middle of the woods as they were anywhere, as long as there was enough good company, stories, booze, and laughter. When they were young, they were on the cutting edge of technology and considered themselves to be modern Americans. They had listened to Mary Robbins, El Paso, or Johnny Horton's North to Alaska on jukeboxes in beer joints all across the country. Those songs were their personal soundtrack, a soundtrack that would never grow old. Now, 60 years later, they were called old-timers. There were long periods of time when they rarely saw each other, as they both married and raised families. As their children grew, they were eventually able to reconnect with their old gang and plan at least a yearly camp out somewhere. The last 20 years, Spike's cabin in the mountains had been the place. Their boys used to come along as well, but they were now raising families and had responsibilities that often precluded going camping with the old man. They talked late into the night, though not as late as they used to in younger days. As usual, they made the late-night ritual of visiting the yard in the pretext of looking at the night sky one last time before bedtime. It had stopped snowing. The night air was crisp and biting. The sky was clear and bright with millions of shimmering winter stars. They remind me of the stars in the desert, Tack said as he created a broken circle of yellow snow near his feet. Colder than hell at night, but daytime was hotter than a smacked ass. Hey, is that a satellite or a UFO? They soon turned in, blew out the candles and lamps, stoked up the fireplace and the stove, and crawled into their sleeping bags. The next morning, they slowly packed up the gear, threw the deer into the bed of the truck, and headed down to the Rough Mountain Road back towards civilization. As Spike left the country road and headed for the interstate in the old truck, he reached into the glove box and found a dirty off-white colored plastic cassette tape and popped it into the console player. The smooth guitar riffs flowed from the speakers as Marty Robbins sang of Rose's Cantina. For an instant, the beat-up Ford F-150 had become a shiny black 1958 Ford Fairlane, and the two old-timers, Spike and Tack, were 21 years old again and hitting the road to Old Mexico. All right, everybody, this is story 2, In the Haunt of the Jackals. On the western edge of the Allegheny Mountain Range, near the confluence of the Bluestone and New Rivers, Jacob Stillertodd laid the foundations for what would become the home place for his family for the next 7 generations. He was advanced in years and in 1772 and had a large family when he began building what would become known as the Stillertodd House. They were German immigrants who had headed west across the mountains during a brief lull in a series of Indian attacks on frontier settlements. With the help of 5 sons and a hired man, soon the nucleus of the house was erected, a fortified blockhouse. Constructed of hand-hewn and neatly dovetailed chestnut, oak, and poplar logs, it was a formidable dwelling. Until it was gradually improved over the years, it started out as a large 2-story cabin with stone fireplaces and chimneys at each end. By the early 19th century, the house and the family living in it had survived many trials. 3 of the Stiller-Todd sons had marched west with Andrew Lewis in 1774 on a path that 20 years later would become the James River and Kanawha Turnpike to fight in Lord Dunmore's War. Only one son returned to tell his parents his brothers were buried in a common grave without their scalps. The family benefited because their home was built along sturdy lines when it was attacked by the Shawnee in the retaliation of the death of Cornstalk several years later. Though none in the household were killed, to this day the outer walls bear the scars of musket ball and arrowhead. Sometime in the years leading up to the American Civil War, the house had an added wing and a wide porch that surrounded the perimeter of the dwelling. By this time, the Stiller-Todd name had been shortened to Stillard, though the name Stiller-Todd was always used when referencing the house itself out of respect for the original settler. As one of the finest houses in the area, it naturally became a destination for those traveling along the crude road that passed it by. As a consequence of being one of the few houses along the road, the Stiller-Todd house became a traveler's rest, allowing weary wayfarers to spend the night and have a meal for a reasonable fee. For many years, the house stood miles away from other dwellings. This natural isolation allowed the Stillards to secretly reap a dark harvest regarding their overnight guests. In other words, not every guest who crossed the threshold of the Stiller-Todd house walked back out again. For many, it was a traveler's rest for eternity. Lone travelers were in the greatest danger, especially those who appeared to have pockets heavy with coin, or exhibited an outward display of above-average wealth. The congenial hosts were always generous to offer a half-frozen traveler a pannikin of hot buttered rum or a gill of whiskey to warm the blood. The sight of a gold watch and chain, or a decided jingle of the pockets, or the flash of a ring on a finger could be enough to put one's life in danger of being snuffed out like a Betty lamp at bedtime. By the 1850s, the Stillards had become rather disreputable in that country. Those who did business with them did so carefully. Whispers of disappearing travelers and stories of secret hideaways somewhere in the Stiller-Todd house that contained a treasure trove of pocket watches, golden rings, and jewelry, as well as bones with skulls missing gold teeth, buried somewhere in the mountains or along the river persisted. It was certainly curious that for a family that had never really prospered at farming, and whose main source of income was taking in travelers, they never lacked for money or horses. Perhaps, if they had not been such a clannish and insular lot and embraced the community around them in a more genteel manner, people would not have been so accusatory. Maybe it was just jealousy of the Stillards' success at running their business that prompted the rumors, or perhaps they were not rumors at all. The Civil War in Western Virginia changed the dynamics of the family business for a time because it brought many more people along the road who needed to spend the night than they had been previously accustomed. For a time, the murders ceased for practical reasons. A lone traveler was one thing, but dozens of refugees or a troop of armed soldiers was quite another. For a time, a group of Union soldiers camped out on the grounds surrounding the house while a high officer resided in the upper room, requisitioning the house as a temporary headquarters. The hosts, though loyal to Old Virginia, had no choice and gladly accepted payment for their services. The official history of the regiment could never fully explain what happened to 2 privates who somehow disappeared during the campaign. An assumption of desertion was made but never proved. The house nearly became somewhat famous in the 1870s when its likeness was put down on paper and almost published in Harper's Weekly. A Civil War veteran named David Hunter Struther, known to the world as Port Canyon, whose work had frequently graced that periodical's pages, took the time to sketch the front of the Stiller Todd house while passing through the district. The drawing got lost in a shuffle of papers and was subsequently forgotten. Unpublished, it now rests somewhere in the State Museum in Charleston in a dark and forgotten recess, along with other rarely consulted historical memorabilia. With the end of the Civil War, the Stillards' business of providing room and board to travelers came to an end, and the house became a private residence once again. The evil recessive gene that had led several generations of Stillards to kill and plunder had gone into remission. With each passing year, the collective memory of the locals grew dimmer regarding the dark history of the Stillard house. Oral history of the supposed events either dwindled down to a few second or third-hand anecdotes, or was blown out of proportion to the point that the whole affair was viewed as a tall tale told on a dark winter's night before a blazing fire to wide-eyed children. Still, there were a few old believers in the area who were certain that somewhere underneath the floorboards or locked away in a closet or between the chinking of that old log cabin there was a hoard of gold watch fobs, wedding rings, diamond brooches, silver buttons, and gold teeth just waiting to be discovered. In the same token, somewhere under that house, or certainly nearby, lay the bones of the forgotten victims of Jacob Stiller Todd's progeny. When Collis P. Huntington brought the railroad through the region in the early 1870s, Arthur Whaley was one of his brighter subordinates. With the completion of the railroad through what became the town of Hinton, Whaley stayed on after sending for his family. Several miles upriver, near the vicinity of the Stiller Todd house, was founded a town that became his namesake, with the spelling simplified to Whaley. It experienced the same life cycle of many similar mountain towns of the era, boom town to eventually nearly ghost town. By the early 1970s, Whaley had been whittled down to a small core of families and businesses. It was a quiet, sleepy, rusty crossroads where the railroad, made famous by the town's founder, seldom, if ever, stopped anymore. In 1973, a clerk working at the State House in Charleston received an application requesting that Stiller Todd House near Whaley, West Virginia, be officially included on the National Register of Historic Places. This set into motion an official survey of the property, which later included an archaeological dig, the first ever conducted on that piece of ground. With the completion of the archaeological dig and an additional series of reports, the Stiller Todd House could very possibly be upgraded from a local landmark to a prominent national status worthy of an article in National Geographic magazine. The wheels of bureaucracy moved slow, but eventually in 1975, an archaeological team was assembled from the College of Graduate Studies in South Charleston and made the circuitous journey down the West Virginia Turnpike to the small community of Whaley. The crew convoyed in 3 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks full of gear and a small sedan. They passed through the Memorial Tunnel on I-77 South and slowly drove along amid a maze of detours and construction. Leaving the turnpike at Beckley, they wove their way along winding roads that eventually led them to cross the New River and head into Whaley, where they had reservations at the only place in town to stay during the dig, the Whaley Motor Inn. There were 7 people assigned to the Stiller Todd dig. The lead archaeologist was Dr. James McCune, a native West Virginian, who was well known in his field and regarded as an expert in early frontier-era archaeology. His assistant was Dr. Doris Kessler, whose doctoral thesis resulted from work she had done with the Buffalo Village dig in the late 1960s in Putnam County. She was an expert in Fort Ancient Indian sites and hoped to find evidence of a Native American presence. The remaining 5 members of the group were young graduate students, Greg Keener, Brian Gardner, Jason Schwerin, and Beth Coulter and Janice Whiting. Of the five, only Greg Keener was a native West Virginian and had spent time in the region as a kid on family vacations. As they drove down the interstate, the three boys were talking about the upcoming dig, their first real one since entering grad school. So what's the story with the Whaley place anyway? Brian Gardner was from Wisconsin, and his knowledge of the area was sparse. Brian had asked Greg, the only West Virginian present, who was the de facto expert on the mountain state. It's Whaley. It's what? It's pronounced Waylay. If you say Whaley, they'll know you're from out of town. Of course, they'll know that anyway. Still, try to say it the way the locals do. It always works out better that way. Okay, so it's Waylay. Waylay. What else do we need to know? Well, the Stillertot house down there, they call it Stillard, was lived in until the 50s, and then it was basically abandoned for a while. I'm sure it's been looted somewhere along the way. Then about 10 years ago, the county cleaned it up and made it into a little museum of sorts, kind of an information center. Some old lady volunteers to sit at a desk for a few hours a week and talks to anyone who stops by about the history of the place. What about the history of the place? Didn't they used to kill people there or something? That's the old story, but there's never been any proof. Maybe we'll turn up something. What happened to the family that lived there? Are they still around? I'm sure some of them must be. Maybe we'll get to meet one of them. I interned out that the Stillertot dig was a little boom for the Motor Inn. The place had been built in 1960, hoping to draw visitors to the recently completed Bluestone Lake. Families wanting to go fishing or take out a boat could stay at the Waylay. For a while, business was good. 15 years later, however, it rarely rented more than a few rooms a week and maybe a few more on the weekends, mostly to college kids from Concord who wanted to have some private time away from the dorm. They seemed to do just enough business to keep afloat, and that was about it. The two professors each got a private room, the three boys got a room, and the two girls got their own room. 4 rooms for at least a full week was a brisk business for the Waylay. They pulled into the small parking lot just after 6 in the evening. The early summer evening was still relatively bright with several hours of sunlight left. Due to the elevation, it was much cooler than they were used to in Charleston. The Motor Inn stretched in a long line alongside the 2-lane. At one end was an office and a small cafe, then a straight row of 12 identical rooms side by side. 8 additional rooms were recently added, and their facade clashed somewhat with the original architecture. The archaeologists slowly exited the vehicles and stretched in the parking area as Dr. McCune stepped toward the office to get the keys to the rooms. I'll check in and get the keys, and then we can see about getting something to eat. The others began removing their luggage and overnight bags and set them on the dark pavement, well shadowed by overhanging trees that seemingly blended into the surrounding green hills. They leaned against the trucks, smoking cigarettes or walking around in small circles, shaking off the road. Dr. McCune rang the little bell on the counter. A smiling man appeared from a doorway that led to a small inner office behind the counter. He wore a red ball cap, and the name Danny was embroidered above his left shirt pocket. "Hello, how are you?" "How are you? I am Dr. McCune. I have some reservations." "Oh, yeah, Dr. McCune. We've been expecting you. The archaeologists, right? Going to work on the Stillard house. Hope you don't find too many old bones. It's considered kind of a spook house round here." "So I've heard. You never know what you might find on a dig," smiled Dr. McCune. "So I've heard. I used to play in that house when I was a kid. Even spent a few nights in it with some of my buddies to see if there were any ghosts." "Were there?" "Hell, I don't remember too much. We got pretty drunk, but I might have heard a few bumps here and there." He chuckled briefly and then got down to business. "Well, let's see. We have you down for 4 rooms for at least 4 nights. Is that right?" "Correct." "All right, here's the keys. We've got you just down from the office. Oh, by the way, if you're interested, we do have 8 new rooms we recently added, and they have coin-operated vibrating beds. It's a new thing a lot of motels have been picking up lately. Helps get the kinks out after a hard day at the office. Anyway, if you'd rather have any of those new rooms, they are $2 extra a night, and we just happen to have all of them available. Thank you, but I think your standard rooms will be just fine. I do have a question, though. Is your restaurant open? Sure is. It's open till 9 tonight. Tonight, we have a country fried steak special, or we've also got the basics if you just need to fill the hole. All right. Thank you very much. You bet. There will be someone here on duty all night should you need anything. Just call or come see us. I'll be here till midnight. Just ask for Danny. Thanks, Danny. We'll be seeing you. I'm sure you will. As Dr. McCune left the office, Danny surveyed the young people in the parking lot. 2 good-looking chicks, an older lady, not too bad-looking, 3 guys, eggheads more likely. He watched as a couple of them bent over to stretch out their backs, noting if change fell out. He dug into the right-hand pocket of his blue jeans and slowly massaged his small bag of gold teeth. He once again felt the pull of the recessive gene, long dormant in the Stillard bloodline. This could be interesting, Danny thought to himself, imagining new places for Bones. All right, y'all, we're on story number 3, the Great Ray's Branch Trout Robbery. Night had fallen, and the last of the parishioners attending the Wednesday night services left the meeting house. Only 2 vehicles remained in the gravel lot outside of the white rectangular cinder block building that served as the local center of worship. A large hand-painted sign above the door of the building read, Dry Fork Tabernacle of the Free Will, with smaller letters beneath that stated, Bible Believing. A single naked bulb burned above the large double doors. The church was dark except for one bright window in the rear of the building that opened on a tiny room that served as the church office. Within that office, 3 men were having a serious conversation. 2 men in their early 20s sat across a small desk from an older, balding gentleman with a decided middle-aged paunch. The older man, Preacher Harvey Brown, was reading the riot act to the 2 boys, Quincy Dillon and Billy Wilson. You boys are in a heap of trouble. I don't want to, but I'm just about to press charges. The boys sat silent and attentive, their ball caps on their laps, their nervous feet gently tapping the plywood floor. The preacher had their attention. Now, I can forgive the time you hung the rubber snakes in the outhouse on Mother's Day. I can forgive the time you drilled holes in the stove wood and packed them with gunpowder. I can forgive the time you spiked the grape juice with wine. I can forgive the time you set off that whoopee cushion just as I was about to utilize old Miss Flanagan at her funeral. I can forgive the time you fed laxatives to the sheep at the live nativity scene on Christmas Eve. But this bull crappery has got to stop. I appreciate the fact that you regularly attend the services, but this time you boys have just gone too far. Tapping Playboy centerfolds on the window blinds was the last straw. You know how that bright sunlight comes through the windows on the east side of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings, and how old Miss Velveteen Simpkins always pulls the blinds down. It nearly gave her a heart attack. The woman's got cataracts. The sunlight hurts her eyes. She just about died when she came to with Carl Arbuncle giving her the mouth-to-mouth. Probably the only time in her life that old maid had a man on top of her, and it was in church. Maybe she thought she died and gone to heaven, said Quincy with a devilish grin. That ain't funny. I'm about to file a nuisance complaint and have you boys banned from the property. And that's not all. I've been checking the law books, and I think I can get a sex offender charge put on you for bringing that pornography into my house of worship. You'd have to register with the authorities in every town you ever live in for the rest of your lives. You won't be able to walk within 1,000 feet of a school. Have to have big sign in your yard telling the whole town you're a pervert. Is that what you want?" The boys answered in unison, "No, preacher." "I didn't think so." The preacher leaned back in his chair, exhausted from his speech and waiting a response. "What can we do, preacher?" said Billy. The preacher sat still, his eyes darting from one to the other and back again. "Well, we might be able to work something out so's I don't have to press no charges. Let's say you boys was to make a donation to the church." Quincy answered, "A donation? How much, preacher? You know we don't got much money." "I know that. I'm talking about a donation of service." "Service? You want us to hold a service?" "Shit, I mean shoot, preacher, we can't preach." "Not that kind of service. Something else." "Well, what, preacher?" "You know our annual ramp dinner's coming up soon. How about you help out with that? You want us to get you a mess of ramps, or you want us to serve the food?" "Neither. I was thinking of adding something special to the ramp dinner this year. I think some fresh trout would go over real good with the community. The ramp dinner's always a big money maker for us, and we're up against quite a bit of competition with the Baptists, Methodists, and other non-denominationals. There's only so many ramp dinners a person can attend, and we want to get as many of the local dollars as we can get, and that means having something more to offer than just ramps, taters, cornbread, and beans. Everybody serves that. I know darn well half my congregation drove over an hour to the ramp dinner at Chloe last year instead of attending ours. I want some trout this year. When the word gets out, everybody will come here and we'll rake in the money. The church needs a new roof. What say you boys was to donate about 1,000 pounds or so of fresh trout for the dinner? I'd consider this pornography business closed, and provided you keep your noses clean after that, I won't press any charges." "But preacher, we're both good fishermen, but we can't catch that much trout in a whole season, even if we caught the bag limit every day," Billy pleaded. "I'm not talking about using a rod and reel here, boys. I got something more substantial in mind." "Like what?" Quincy asked. "You know old Jake Gilly? He's married to my wife's sister." "Yeah, he's got a good-looking daughter. That's my wife's niece you're talking about, son." "Sorry, preacher." "Well, forget about her. Jake drives the trout stalking truck in his district. He's also a philandering backslider. I got people that seen his truck outside beer joints in Summersville when I know darn well he told my wife's sister he was in Flatwoods all day. I can't prove nothing, but there's a girl goes to the middle school with my daughter who's the spitting image of Jake, and her mother ain't his wife. Now, I can find out his trout stalking schedule, and when he's going to be stalking Dry Fork, Ray's Ranch, and Ford's Creek, you boys just be waiting by the road and just take the whole darn truck. Hide out in the mountains till nightfall, then bring it out back, and we'll process the store and store it in the big freezer in the kitchen. You figure it out. It ought to be easy." 10 minutes later, Preacher Brown watched as the taillights of the boys' pickup faded into the blackness, the muffler protesting as Quincy's mud-crusted boot laid on the gas. The preacher stood by his sedan in the light of the open car door. Unthinking, he reached under the seat of his pint of old granddad, unscrewed the cap, instinctively looked down the road to the left and right, and took a long pull on the bottle. He pulled a pack of Pall Malls out of the inside pocket of his sports jacket, lit one, and leaned back against the side of the car. As he blew smoke out of his nose, he muttered to himself, "I just hope those two idiots don't screw this thing up." Fortunately for him, none in his flock was aware of his checkered past, and he wanted to keep it that way. His former life, before moving to the mountain community and starting his own church, was not the holiest. Blessed with a natural gift of oratory and persuasion, he spent many of his pre-preaching years talking himself in and out of a variety of schemes and flim-flams. His conversion came years later after doing time in Moundsville for grand larceny. The preacher's plan to hijack the trout stocking truck was no spur-of-the-moment idea, for he was once a hijacker himself. One time he nabbed a whole truck of liquor. Back then, he went by the name Jimmy Johnson and had a steady job as a truck driver with a legitimate CDL. One of his few claims to fame that were not outright lies or half-truths. He was in his second year hauling liquor for Rite Aid when, perhaps on an impulse, he just stole the whole load. County deputies and state patrolmen searched in vain for the missing truck and its errant driver for 3 days. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, the truck, minus 2/3 of the liquor, was found stuck in the mud at the head of a remote hollow just outside of Richwood. The local canine unit, which consisted of 2 country deputies and a deputized coon hunter and his howling pack, soon found the highly intoxicated thief sleeping beneath sheltered pines 2 miles from the abandoned vehicle. The missing liquor was never found, though the ground behind the half-open door of the truck bore the telltale tracks of ATV tires and hunting boots. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Moundsville State Penitentiary, and it was there he met a real preacher. His cellmate was one Reverend Joe Clark doing time for mail fraud. Clark was a local televangelist who had a program on a small affiliate in the days before cable television. He and his sidekick, Sister Sally Ann Johnson, preached hellfire and brimstone sermons, his voice often hoarse from screaming the gospel as he saw it. Every Sunday morning, his loyal viewers would be glued to their small TV sets in farmhouses and tiny trailers all throughout the mountains. His high-pitched screaming often reached his viewers with a great deal of distortion due to the combination of substranded equipment in the tiny studio and the cheap speakers on the little TV sets. His specialty was his claim to be able to heal his faithful followers of any number of physical infirmities through the television screen. As droplets of sweat ran down his high forehead beneath his dark pompadour, he would close his eyes and press his gold-ringed fingers against the glass of the video camera. He would implore the faithful to touch the television screen to receive a healing. He claimed also to be able to heal small appliances and 2-cycle engines in the same way. His trouble with the law and the source of his mail fraud conviction happened after a widow woman kept receiving letters addressed to her long-dead husband, thanking him for a past donation and asking for another. Since the faithful widow had written a number of letters to Reverend Clark informing him of her husband's demise, it was vexing that the Reverend continued to send letters to a dead man. She contacted authorities, and after federal agents searched the dumpster behind Reverend Clark's headquarters, they found the damning evidence. Since Clark promised on camera to personally read and pray over every single prayer request, why was it that all of the envelopes in the dumpster were found slashed with a razor and only the monetary donations removed? A judge ruled in a court of law that the evidence indicated that the preacher had not in fact read any of the letters and was not praying but preying on his misguided, innocent followers. Reverend Clark was sentenced to 5 years. Sharing a cell with Reverend Clark sowed the seeds of a new life and a new scam for Jimmy Johnson. After his release, 4 years later for good behavior, he changed his name to Harvey Brown, moved to a rural mountain community where he was an unknown entity, married a local girl, and started his own church. With a rudimentary knowledge of Scripture, he took crash correspondence courses on the Bible and basic theology. He joined a discreet mail-order service that provided ready-made sermons for a small fee and slowly built up a flock. His personal motto was, "Give the people what they want." If they were against alcohol, preach temperance. If they were against abortion, preach pro-life. He gauged the moral tone of his community and essentially told his people what they wanted to hear. All the while, he stayed true to his own personal moral code, though his code was not necessarily moral in itself. That twisted code was now manifesting itself in his scheme to reap ill-gotten monetary gain from selling stolen trout at his ramp dinner. Jake Gilley had just walked through the door of his modest home, perched up on a hillside just outside the town limits, when the telephone rang in the kitchen. He grabbed the receiver. Hello? Hello, Jake. Harvey, how are you? What I can do for you? Oh, I was just wondering when you were going to start stalking trout this spring. You going fishing? Hell, Harvey, I've never known you to be a fisherman. Well, the doctor told me that I've been working too hard and I need to find something relaxing to do. And I just thought I'd take up fishing this year. Well, okay. Now, let me see. I'm getting a load at the hatchery next Thursday morning, and I'll be stalking through Saturday. Where at? That would be Forge Creek, Dry Fork, and Ray's Branch. When are you stalking Ray's Branch? I'll actually be hitting that one first. So that would be on Thursday next week. All right, then. Appreciate the information. I just might make it out there and try my luck. Well, all right, buddy. I hope you catch a mess of them. That's my plan. How's Liza Jane? Fit as a fiddle. Later that day, Preacher Brown called Quincy Dillon and informed him of the stalking schedule. Preacher Brown ended the conversation with a piece of advice. I've been thinking it over, and it might be best if you boys don't take the whole truck after all. That might be too hard to hide, and if you're caught with it, you'll surely go to jail. What do we do if we don't take the whole truck? Well, Jake's truck looks like a big cylinder set on its side. It's got this big hose that shoots the trout into the stream, like a big HVAC hose. So if you was to fill up the back of your truck somehow, you could get enough trout and not alert the authorities that some of their trout's missing. We might be able to figure something out. And don't take a gun. That's another 5 years if you get caught committing a crime. How come you know so much about the law, preacher? Oh, let's just say I sort of used to do prison ministry. I used to spend a lot of time talking with convicts. Which reminds me, do a good job, because there's no statute of limitations on pornography charges. That evening, as Quincy and Billy held a strategy session, Billy came up with a viable plan. I've got an idea. My great-granddaddy told me once how he and 3 other fellers stole a bunch of coal off a coal train right after World War II when he came back from the Pacific. He said it was a cold winter. Granddaddy called it a horse collar winter, and they was running low on coal. What's a horse collar winter? That's where it's so cold that you hang a horse collar on the wall behind the wood stove. And when you need to go to the outhouse, you take that warm horse collar with you and just sit on it. Makes sense. So he had this feller flag down a coal train with a lantern and red bandana and told the driver the train had hit somebody back down the line. While the train was stopped, my granddaddy and the 2 other guys was shoveling coal into the back of a 39 Ford pickup. Granddaddy said he made 2 successful runs, and on the 3rd run he wrecked his truck because it was cold out and he'd been drinking whiskey the whole time to keep warm. Suppose one of us could cause a diversion, get Jake Gilly's attention, and the other could hose that trout into the bed of your truck. How's the bed of my truck gonna hold that water without it all seeping out the sides? I know how. My sister's got one of those little round plastic kiddie pools her kids used to play in when they were little. They haven't used it in years. It's laying up against the shed behind their house. That could work. I could just slip up there some night and grab it. We could put it in the back of your truck, get the trout, and I could have it back behind the shed before they even miss it. Sounds like a plan. The boys stood on the concrete floor of the sheet metal barn that stood behind Billy's father's house. The barn stored several ATVs, a farm tractor, and served as a general workshop. A long wooden workbench ran along the wall to one side, above which generations of hand and electrical tools were stored. Several rumpled polytarps and an acetylene torch, along with a generator and gas cans, took up the far corner. A small faded blue child-sized plastic swimming pool had become the building's latest center of attention. The pool was a bit overdue for service. It was filled with a scattering of old rotted leaves and skim of dirt, the boys' attention was drawn to a large crack that ran down the center of the pool's floor. Quincy tilted his head, surveying the damage. I suppose we could fiberglass it. We don't got the time to do it up exactly right. I say we just duct tape it up real good. I got a whole roll of Gorilla Tape. That might do it. Then we can test it with the hose. In the end, they decided to use a combination of duct tape painted over with Thompson's water seal, and a covering of silicone gel for good measure. The pool fit in the back of Quincy's truck. They tested it with a water hose and then sealed it. They had a hard time draining the pool once it was in the truck, as it was too heavy to tip. They had to drive the truck up a steep slope behind the house in order to provide the appropriate angle to get the water started flowing over the edge of the pool. There was now only one more thing to do. Just before nightfall the following evening, Quincy and Billy drove the narrow road that followed Ray's branch. They were looking for a level, straight stretch that would serve their purpose. They picked out a stretch of road that looked like it would work and then searched for a suitable tree nearby. They found it in a large dead ash, a victim of a recent blight. After scouting the location, they headed back to Billy's dad's workshop to rest and get ready. Back in the workshop, they did an equipment check. They had heavy rope, an axe, tire tools, a polytarp with bungee cords, and 2 walkie-talkies. You'll take your Chevette? Quincy told Billy. Yep. They set out at 4:30 the next morning, Quincy in his truck and Billy in the little Chevette. They parked beside the dead ash tree, and Billy helped to hoist Quincy up into its formidable branches. With nimble fingers, Quincy lashed one end of the long rope around the tree high up on the trunk. They then tugged on the rope until the tree gave way with a loud crack and began to lean over the road. Several strategically placed licks with the axe, a chainsaw, could attract unwanted attention, and the tree crashed down over the road. They worked in tandem, pulling the tree parallel to the side of the road and out of the way of oncoming traffic. You think you can drag it back by yourself? Quincy asked. Yeah, I can do it. Just give me enough warning. As they had about 3 hours to kill until the trout truck was expected, they headed into town for breakfast. They sat facing each other in a booth along with the early breakfast crowd at the Fried Mater, a local landmark mom-and-pop restaurant. What's that kiddie pool doing in your truck, Quincy? The waitress, Martha Campbell, asked as she looked over the top of her order pad at Quincy's truck parked right outside the window. She had graduated high school with both of them and knew them and their vehicles well. Quincy had to think fast. Well, that's for my hunting dogs. Your hunting dogs? You're fooling. How so? Well, it seems every time I take them out at night, they always roll in something nasty and it stinks up the whole back of the truck. I can't stand to be around them when they smell that bad, so I just decided to rig me up a bathtub for them. Now, when we go out, I fill that pool up with soapy water and I throw them in there. The bumpy road acts as a natural agitator, and by the time we get home, they smell like roses. Oh, that's cool. What'll you have? They ordered fried eggs, country ham, and red-eye gravy, and plenty of buttermilk biscuits to sop with. As they ate, Billy began thinking about the mission on which they were about to embark. Do you think we can actually pull this thing off? I mean, it seems kind of crazy just for a damn ramp supper. I think it'll work, but sometimes I think preachers just plumb crazy. He knows he can get a new roof on the church donating to him. The donation could all be written off on taxes. Yeah, I wonder about him sometimes. I swear I smelled liquor on his breath one time at the church picnic. Well, Kitty Klein told me she swears she saw him in the Southern Exposure parking lot down in Logan. I hear they don't rotate the stock down there. It's all 100% local girls. What's Kitty doing at Southern Exposure? She hits the amateur night circuit at all the strip joints. I'm Facebook friends with her. She was in Barbersville last weekend. When's she gonna go pro? Hell, I don't know. She sure got the rack for it. She's got some ham on her too. I sure like me some ham on a woman. After Martha took their dirty plates away, They ordered more coffee, and the talk returned to trout. Billy remarked, "You know that hatchery trout don't taste as good as natives." "Yeah, it's what they feed 'em at the hatchery. When I was a little kid, I went with my dad to visit a buddy at his up near Elkins somewhere. He had a big pond on his property, and he was having a fishing rodeo and fish fry for all his friends. He had the pond stocked with channel cat. First time I ever caught a catfish. I love eating catfish." You wouldn't have liked the fish we caught. Raunchiest catfish I ever tasted." "What was wrong with it?" "It was what he fed 'em. Dog food, dry granules. Eating them fish. Might as well have just opened up a can of Alpo and ate it with the spoon. Would have cut out the middleman." Billy noted the sunlight over the ridge from the window and checked his watch. "We better be going. It's about time." They followed each other out to Ray's Branch, Billy driving in the lead and Quincy following. When they got about a mile and a half from the dead ash tree, Quincy pulled off the road and waited while Billy drove on. Billy drove just past the downed tree and around the bend so that his Chevette could not be seen. He pulled to the roadside and removed the tire tools from his trunk and proceeded to jack up the car and remove the rear passenger tire. A few minutes later, Quincy's voice crackled on the walkie-talkie. Rainbow to Brownie, green light. This is Brownie, 10-4. Billy threw the walkie-talkie in the back seat of the Chevette and ran around the bend to the downed tree, grabbing hold of the stout rope and pulled it across the road. Once he got the tree free of the berm, it scooted fairly easily, and soon he had the road blocked. He got the seat of his britches caught in a nasty patch of multiflora rose as he struggled to remove the now suspicious-looking rope entangled in its formidable branches. He had just finished cutting the rope in two places with his pocket knife and throwing the rope in the bushes behind him when he heard and then saw Jake Gilly approaching in the trout stalking truck. Jake immediately slowed and then halted upon seeing the large tree across the road. He put the truck in park and left the engine running as he saw Billy Wilson walking toward him. The downed tree a few feet behind him, Jake stepped down from the truck. "Hey, Billy, you all right?" "Yeah, I'm okay, but my car ain't." "You didn't get hit by that tree falling down, did you?" "No, I got a flat round the bend. I pulled over and started to change it when the damn tree just fell with no kind of warning. Scared the hell out of me. Could you give me a hand with my tire and then we can move that tree? I got an axe in the trunk." Jake looked back at his truck, a little uncertain what was best to do. "All right, let's change that tire right quick. I don't want that cargo to sit too long. I'm not really supposed to leave the truck." From a distance, Quincy watched Jake leave the protection of the truck and walk around the bend to help Billy. He pulled up alongside the truck and unlocked the large hose from the side of the tank. It took him 30 seconds to figure out how to turn on the hose. He had the pool filled up in 8 minutes, careful to pick up any fish that had missed the back of the truck and landed on the asphalt. He quickly replaced the hose and spread the dirty blue poly tarp over the pool and tied the corners down with bungee cords. Quincy then parked behind the stalking truck and walked up the road past the downed tree and around the bend. "Hey, Billy, what are you doing?" "Hey, Jake." "Well, hey, Quincy. Billy's got a flat and we got to get that tree moved so I can finish stalking. Come on, give us a hand." They had Billy's tire changed and the spare inflated with a 12-volt compressor Billy kept in the trunk in no time. With 3 of them, it took little effort to move the tree to the side of the road. They talked for a minute as Jake smoked a cigarette and then they parted. Jake to finish his job and the boys to finish theirs. Preacher Brown was waiting by the back door of the church that led to the modest kitchen when Quincy's truck pulled up with the goods. They quickly removed the bungee cords and the poly tarp and for the first time had a good look at the stolen trout. There were a couple of floaters, but most looked healthy. Quincy asked what was on his mind. "How are we going to get them all out of the pool? You got a bucket or something?" "No, I've got something better than that. Here, give me a hand with this hose." "What is that? A shop vac?" "Yep, It's an industrial strength shop vac specially made for sucking up liquids and such. I got it last night at the Lowe's in Buchanan. Used the church's rainy day fund. I even got the hose extension so we can just suck them trout right into the kitchen in nothing flat, and nobody'll never know. The preacher stuck the mouth of the large hose into the pool, and Billy held it, while the preacher disappeared into the kitchen and flipped the switch. A dull hum emanated from behind the kitchen door as water and trout started disappearing into the mouth of the great hose. The boys took turns moving the hose all around the perimeter of the pool until all the trout were gone and the pool was nearly empty. How much will that thing hold? Reckon we're about to find out. They opened the kitchen door and Quincy signaled his hand slashing across his neck horizontally to cut off the machine. No sooner had the preacher flipped the off switch and the noise died down, he had the top off of the shop vac checking his treasure. By golly, we done it, boys. Look at all them trout. Now, the fun part's over. Let's get them cleaned and in the freezer. He tossed each boy a cheap, clear plastic emergency rain poncho and put one on himself. Here, put these on. They'll keep your clothes clean from all them fish guts. It took them 4 solid hours to gut, rinse, and package the trout. They took turns slitting open the bellies, removing the entrails, which were dropped back into the shop vac, rinsing the carcasses, and stuffing them in gallon Ziploc freezer bags. By nightfall, the freezer was stuffed to the gills with stolen hatchery fresh rainbow trout. The ramp dinner is this coming Saturday. We got a Lions Club circus tent rented to set up in the side lot. I need you boys here about 4 on Friday to help set up that tent. The church ladies will be here Friday evening as we'll cooking up the beans, cornbread, ramps, and taters. We'll have the Lions Club fellers bring in their big cooker for the trout. I've been advertising on the radio and in the paper about the trout and ramp supper. I expect we'll have quite a crowd. Oh, and if anybody asks where the trout come from, you just tell them to see me. Now, you two, get this shop vac out of here. Throw it in the creek behind the Baptist church. Just get it out of here. By the way, could I have the kiddie pool? I could use it for baptisms in bad weather or when the creek's down. So many people showed up for the trout and ramp dinner at the Dry Fork Tabernacle of the Free Will that cars and trucks lined the road on either side for hundreds of yards leading up to the church. Beside the huge white tent was a large cooking operation to handle the trout. One could have the standard ramp dinner for $6 a plate or $9 for a plate with trout. A bluegrass band with a sound system was set up on a flatbed trailer perpendicular to the circus tent. They were playing My Home is in the Blue Ridge Mountains as Preacher Brown greeted his guests. And how are you, Miss McLeod? And how's your Uncle Joe? Just fine, thank you, Preacher. Mr. Tucker, how are you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you, Preacher. A tall man in a tan uniform and silver belly Stetson walked up to the preacher. A shorter, younger man, also in uniform, followed from behind. How are you, Harvey? Quite a spread you put out this year. Thank you, Sheriff. Willie Moore had been the county sheriff since before Jimmy Johnson reinvented himself as Harvey Brown. What do you think? Did you get some trout? Hell, I haven't seen this many people in one place since I was a little kid and slipped under the canvas to see 3-titted gypsy woman dance in the hoochie coo tent at the county fair. Of course, that was before I got saved, you understand. We were all young once, Sheriff. The deputy spoke a little too enthusiastically. Did she really have 3 titties, Sheriff? Not now, Carl. I'll tell you about it in the squad car. Now you get you some food and then keep an eye open. With a spread like this, there's bound to be folks out itching to steal this trout. The deputy hit the leather holster on his right hip with a loud slap. Okay, Sheriff. The sheriff asked the preacher about the trout. Where'd you get all this trout anyway, Harvey? Before I moved here, I had a little congregation out west, and one of the parishioners made quite a name for himself in the meat packing business. And now, every year, he buys a mess of trout or buffalo burger or something exotic like that, flash freezes it, and sends it to a charitable organization. He gets a big tax write-off, and everybody's happy. If I could draw your attention to that table over there, we have a very fine thank you card made by the Sunday school children to send him, and we have a donation jar so we can raise enough money to send him a fruit basket. Where's that card? And you can count me in for $5 on that fruit basket. Thank you, Sheriff. I know he'll appreciate it. The sheriff signed the card that thanked Mr. Jimmy Johnson for sending the trout. The fiddler in the bluegrass band took an instrumental break and seamlessly moved from Soldier's Joy to Liberty as the preacher welcomed more guests. And how are you, Miss Roy? Where's Gil? Oh, you know, those little red-haired boys, preacher. He's probably on his second helping of trout by now. Boy must have a tapeworm for all I feed him. And how are you, Miss Herbert? How's Hiram? He's down in the back, preacher. But he sent me to be sure and get him a plate of trout and ramps to take back to him. You give him my best and tell him I'll be out to see him soon. Thank you, preacher. The band was on the chorus of Rose of Old Kentucky when the preacher signaled to Quincy and Billy to join him under the large sycamore that shaded the church parking lot. Boys, you did a good job. And I got just one more thing I'd like you to get done for me, and we'll be square on this little matter of ours. You mean this didn't square it up, preacher? Almost. I read in the paper yesterday about a train derailment down near Fayetteville. Train was carrying a load of building supplies and roofing shingles. Think you boys could head down there and see if you can procure enough shingles to put a new roof on the church? I sure would appreciate it. Oh, and try to make them all the same color. The band played on into the night until all the beans, cornbread, ramps, potatoes, and trout were gone. The sheriff and his deputy made sure none of the trout were stolen, and all was sold legally by the church. The Baptists had trouble drawing a decent crowd on their ramp supper due to the unexplained presence of strong odors that rose up from the creek behind the church. As Jake Gilly and his wife Liza Jane drove away, Jake thought the fish tasted oddly familiar. Then he saw Preacher Brown pointing up to the downspouts of the little church as Quincy Dillon and Billy Wilson knelt down on the roof with a tape measure. For just an instant, Jake felt a wave of suspicion pass through his mind. Then just as quickly as it was gone, and he drove his wife home. The church received enough donations to send Mr. Johnson a deluxe fruit basket. That night, Preacher Brown thanked God for wild leaks, pornography, loyal parishioners, and gullible lawmen as he began making plans for next year's ramp supper. All right, y'all, we're on the next story. It's called Cathedral. It was said that in the days before the virgin timber was all stripped away from the mountains, that one had to strike a match at noon just to read a pocket watch. The towering stands of white oak, yellow poplar, red spruce, silver maple, white pine, birch, and hemlock blocked out the noonday sun with their wide-reaching branches and rich foliage. Except for patches of laurel thickets and deadfall, there was little undergrowth to hinder the traveler who made his way between the wide trunks of these primeval giants of the eastern forest. So cool and shaded were the woods that in some dark hollows the winters grew so cold that the ice refused to melt the year round along the darkest portions of nearby stream beds. Thick mats of bright green moss and knee-high ferns formed a living carpet that lined much of the forest floor. Cold mountain streams and rocky rivers wound their way through the silent woodlands, often as a trickle in the summer and fall and a smooth-flowing torrent in the spring. Native trout flourished in the clear, pure mountain streams, while bear, deer, and panthers roamed the jagged ridgelines and rich bottom land at will. The brush teemed with grouse and rabbit, while the gray squirrel built ragged nests high in the tops of the tallest trees or behind the sequestered knotholes of hollowed-out behemoths. From the tops of certain mountainous rock formations, one could enjoy an unobstructed view of the rolling mountains of spruce. The bite of the wind as it snapped against a waxed canvas hunting coat or snuck under a hat brim and blew it away as quickly as if it were cast from a fly rod was cool and refreshing. The layered mountains suddenly transformed from deep green to faded blue as they took on an almost ocean-like appearance. with each subsequent ridgeline another wave on an endless inland sea. As idyllic, timeless, and serene as such a setting must seem, it is easy to assume life here was equally so. It was, in fact, for the first settlers of the region, a very hard life often lived on the edge. The mountains provided all that was needed for one to live a prosperous life, but it was not given for free. Cabins did not build themselves, nor did corn grow with the wave of a hand. It took many generations before the process of natural selection seemingly weeded out the weak and lazy and rewarded the strong and resourceful. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the roots of many mountain families were firmly established. Their people had arrived in waves down the wagon roads, bringing with them the scheitholt, the fiddle, the long rifle, the whiskey still, and an independent spirit matched only by the wilderness of the land they settled. They had claimed their land through tomahawk rights, cleared it all by hand, built their homes, and raised their families. They fought the Indians and then the British. After the British, they fought the Indians again. The very act of frontier taming sealed the fate of the frontiersmen and paved the way for the new modern America to invade the borders of the virgin mountain country from all sides. In the end, the mountain people found they had more in common with the painted warriors they had fought so hard to displace than many of their own countrymen who dwelled outside of the mountains. While the country as a whole boomed with the might and promise of the Industrial Revolution, the nation demanded the seemingly infinite natural bounty of the mountains. Little regard was given for those whose forebears had settled and tamed that wild land, and whose bones rested in family plots in the sleepy shade of silent groves. The mountain people found themselves caught between two worlds, one of agriculture and tradition, the other industrial and modern. It was in this time and place that two men slowly meandered together beside a peaceful summer stream lined with birch and hemlock, occasionally high-stepping to negotiate deadfall or ducking down to skirt a low-hanging limb. Golden beams of sunlight sifted down through the maze of layered branches of numberless trees, creating bright patches of light on the forest floor. Their ears were greeted by the gentle gurgling of the moving water as it flowed unevenly over the rocks, rotten logs, and other debris that had been naturally deposited in its wake since the beginning of time. Both men were strong and relatively young, though one was 10 years senior to the other. The older man wore a slouched felt hat and work clothes with suspenders and heavy boots. His mustache ran down both sides of his face to the chin. The face and hands on his lean frame were tan and lined from a life spent in the wilderness. He carried a satchel slung on his shoulder and a double-barreled shotgun well balanced in his right hand. The younger man had a smooth face and wore more expensive clothing that gave him away as a city dweller. He carried a long walking stick and a small rucksack containing a ledger and writing materials. He had contracted the older man to guide him through this seemingly endless patch of forest. As a representative for an out-of-state timber concern, he was the vanguard of what would eventually become a flood of humanity into the mountain country of lumbermen and all the peripheral hangers-on that such a business entailed. Such men were the beginning of the end for the endless tracts of forests and for the settled pre-industrial way of life that had existed for generations. They paused beside the stream, and both men kneeled, their knees resting on thick pillows of moss, and drank of the mountains. "This is the best water I've ever tasted," remarked the younger man. "Back in Philadelphia, most people don't even drink water if they can help it, unless it's boiled in tea or coffee. There are whole areas with houses lined up side by side, every one of them with an outhouse and either a well or a water pump right beside it." "Just how much further do ye wish to go, Mr. Samuels?" "Oh, I think we can head back any time, Mr. Carpenter. Thank you. I think I've seen all I need to see this past week. I think my people will be very pleased with your folk. I certainly could not have found my way around this jumbled wilderness without you. I'd have been lost in a quarter of an hour." "Well, it's just the woods. There's plenty of paths and game trails. You just need to know what to look for. Say, what exactly do your people intend to do with this country? I heard they was a-bringing in the railroad." "That will happen eventually, sooner than later, I imagine. Then we will cut the timber, process it, and sell it. some for boards, much of it for pulp for paper. Either way, it should turn a generous profit. The older man took all of this in with stoic silence, his blue eyes scanning the dense wilderness of endless trees. His trout fishing excursions, hunting and foraging expeditions, and certainly his whole lifestyle seemed doomed and uncertain. What about when ye cut down all the timber? What then? The younger man scanned the same ground as the older man, yet rather than seeing the dense wilderness of vertical living trees, he saw dense horizontal piles of neatly stacked raw timber and cut lumber. His hunting expedition would bear a different fruit from the older man. Then we will move on. You know my uncle passed through this country with the Union Army. He told me about how beautiful it was, and I always intended to see it for myself. I must say, now that I have seen it for myself, I will always remember it as it now stands. It's like no other place on earth. So quiet, so green. The two men left the forest and were back to the tiny settlement by nightfall, where the timberman enjoyed another home-cooked meal with the older man's family. That night each man had a fitful sleep. The older man was troubled by the prospect of losing his surroundings and the land on which he was raised. The younger man dreamed of endless green mountains of spruce that slowly turned into endless mountains of green-colored paper.